Hi, I'm Mr. Williamson, and this video is about anaerobic respiration. Good idea to take some notes, Cornell style outline, use a crayon. I don't know, I don't care. You do your thing, but notes are important, mostly just for the process of writing them down. It's where you learn the material. All right. Before we get started, make sure that as we go through the Edpuzzle, if you're watching this on Edpuzzle, you ask good questions you don't understand. Let me help you on that, or ask me in class. And let's get started. Anaerobic respiration is respiration is done without oxygen. Up till now, everything like in your body, and that's what I try to tend to focus on in your body. And if everything's working well, you have oxygen. So you've eaten food, which gives us glucose. And the glucose has been brought into the circulatory system and taken to your cells in cytoplasm. It goes through glycolysis, breaking it down to the pyruvic acids. You get a couple ATP, a couple NADH2s. The pyruvic acids go into the mitochondria and the inner membrane, where they go through the Krebs cycle. We get a couple more ATPs, a whole bunch more NADH2s and FADs, and those move out to the electron transport chain and the outer membrane of the mitochondria, where oxygen is the final ion acceptor, where we can combine the hydrogen ions with oxygen to create water. But what happens if oxygen isn't available? That's anaerobic respiration. That's what we're going to talk about right now. There are two different types. Anaerobic respiration is respiration that takes place with oxygen. I just explained all that. But there's two different types. There's lactic acid fermentation, which occurs in your body, and alcoholic fermentation, which occurs in plants or yeast, something like that. The problem with anaerobic respiration is most of the energy that we're trying to get out of that glucose stays in the byproducts. It stays in the alcohol, the lactic acid, and it can't be converted into the ATP. And for the energy to attach at phosphate to ADP to make ATP, in other words, it's not efficient. We don't get as many ATP molecules out of it, and we'll go into how many we do get. All right. Lactic acid fermentation takes place in animal cells in you. It would be something you would experience if you work out too hard, like wind sprints, that kind of thing, that burning, or you're lifting weights and that burning feeling you get in your muscles, is basically you're asking your muscles to produce ATP at a rate through the electron transport chain at a rate that you can't get oxygen to it. You can't carry the oxygen through your circulatory system to the cells fast enough to supply the electron transport chain with that final ion acceptor to make water and allow the 34 ATPs to be made. So you get lactic acid fermentation. So what exactly is it? Well, the oxygen is consumed, becomes scarce, and we still have the problem with the NADH2s holding those hydrogen ions. So they got to put them someplace. They can't hold them forever. So they donate them back to pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid, remember, was the product of glycolysis. We broke glucose down to pyruvic acid. Well, if we put the hydrogens back on, we produce this thing called lactic acid. Lactic acid is an acid. It actually burns inside your muscles. All right? And that's that burning feeling you get. It looks kind of like this. And again, I wouldn't even write this down. If you understand that we need a place to put the hydrogens, where can we put them? We'll attach them to the pyruvic acid, so they're going to go together. Take the pyruvic acid, attach the hydrogen in that whole process, and the end result is lactic acid. Like I said, that burns your muscles. Now, when you're all done exercising and you get enough oxygen, your circulatory system will carry that lactic acid back to your liver, where it can turn it back into glucose. And then it will be released in your system, and your body can go back to making ATP. Simple enough, okay? But it's actually, if you think about it, it really is. The lactic acid burning in your muscles is what is hurting your muscles. Alcoholic fermentation takes place in plants and yeast. I'm going to talk about alcoholic fermentation in wine, beer, and distilled spirits, and explain some things there, because that's pretty much, and also in baking. We also use a lot of alcoholic fermentation in baking. Okay, same process. You don't have a lot of oxygen. You've got a lot of sugars. If you think about it, let's talk about right now, let's talk about making wine. You take grape juice, you juice the grapes. They've got a lot of sugar in. Grapes are sweet. There's yeast on the grapes. They actually is naturally occurring. So when you juice the grapes and mash it all up and put it into a barrel, which does not have access to oxygen, it starts to break down those sugars. The yeast, a living organism, goes through glycolysis. It produces the pyruvic acid, but there's no oxygen. So what does it do? It converts it into alcohol. Okay, and that's how we get wine. Or we could do that with hops and barley. All right, the yeast would break down the sugars in hops, and hops are a type of flour, I think. And barley's a grain, and all of that can be broken down and can be used to produce glucose for the yeast, and the end result would be beer. Or if we do it with like potatoes, you can do it, you make vodka. But the difference between wine, beer, and vodka is that vodka has been distilled. You actually evaporate it and condense it and make it. That's why spirits like vodka, whiskey, things like that. Whiskey comes from, by the way, corn and other grains. Rum comes from, I think, sugar. Tequila comes from the agave plant. All of them have the same process, though. There's an organism that is breaking down the sugars without oxygen, producing alcohol. But all those are actually used. We distill them. We evaporate out the some of the things and like make them more percentage of alcohol. And I'm going to explain why we have to do that in a moment. But the process that it goes through to do this is pretty much the same as lactic acid. You end up with, you need a place to put the hydrogens. So you attach it to the pyruvic acid in the process. And I don't care about the process. Just get the understanding that alcohol fermentation, just like lactic acid fermentation, you got to put the hydrogen someplace, put them back on pyruvic acid. End result, you get ethyl alcohol and you get carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide, by the way, is where the baking comes in. We mix yeast with flour and water and sugar. Maybe you add a little salt, but the salt is actually for your flavoring. It's not for the yeast. But we add some sugar. The yeast feeds on that sugar inside the flour. Well, the flour prevents oxygen from getting, that dough prevents the oxygen from getting into the yeast. Therefore, it goes into alcoholic fermentation. And if you've ever baked bread from scratch, you know the flavor of the smell of baking bread. It has an alcoholic smell. That's because as you're baking it, the alcohol is actually being driven off, evaporated from the bread. But what's left behind are the little pockets of carbon dioxide. And that's what gives bread it that little, I don't know how to, the holes that the butter melts into. Like an English muffin, it has the holes the butter melts into. Or if you get French bread, it has bigger holes. I don't know the technical term, but whatever those little bubble-like holes in bread, that's all caused by carbon dioxide from alcoholic fermentation, from yeast. Each one of those was a place where a yeast or 2 or 3 cells kept eating the sugar, or bringing the sugar, glycolysis, making ATP, no oxygen, producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. The thing about beer and wine, though, by law, from what I understand, you cannot distill it. All right, so beer and wine, I think is about 7%. It's right around there. And bottom line is that alcohol is a poison. And if you're let's say you're a yeast cell and you're living in this barrel over here, this barrel of grape juice, and you're having a great time, man, it's like unlimited sugars. And so one, you're multiplying, and they just multiply by budding, splitting in half. Okay, so it's like, well, now you start out as one, or maybe you and 100 of your friends. Okay, and then you multiply, and then there's 200, and then there's 400, there's 800, and you keep going. Meanwhile, you're just eating on that sugar and having a good time, going through glycolysis, breaking down into pyruvic acid, but hey, there's no oxygen because you're in a barrel. And so you're putting where you put the hydrogen, it's put it back on pyruvic acid, and that becomes alcohol. Alcohol's a poison. You are basically swimming around in grape juice and poison, alcohol. And so slowly that alcohol starts to build up percentage wise, all right, until it becomes to the percentage and the concentration that becomes lethal to you. So you are actually, eventually you die because you are surrounded in alcohol, which kills you. And at that point, it levels off at about 7%. By law, from what I understand, you're not allowed, the manufacturers are not allowed to distill that down. That's what they do with things like port or something like that, a fortified wine, is they distill it. How do they do that? You heat it up, it evaporates certain things, evaporates some of the flavoring and a lot of the alcohol, because alcohol boils at a lower temperature, so it boils out earlier. And then you can you have the distilled spirit, but that's how they make spirits, is they distill them. But beer and wine, put it in a barrel, let it ferment, alcohol is produced until it basically kills off the yeast. In the same time, it becomes carbonated naturally, like champagne is a carbonated spirit because of the carbon dioxide produced in the process. So respiration, and overview of the whole thing, all right, summarize the last 4 or 5 videos. Respiration is the breakdown of glucose. All right, why do we eat glucose? We break it down with oxygen because the oxygen gives us the final ion acceptor in the electron transport chain to get those 34 ATP. Okay, and the byproducts are water. Why water? Because oxygen is accepting 2 hydrogens. H2O becomes water, and carbon dioxide. Where do we get the carbon dioxide? We're breaking it off of the glucose throughout the Krebs cycle. So you exhale the carbon dioxide, and the water also goes out when you exhale. All right. So to review the entire overview of respiration is, why do we need glucose? Because in glucose is the bonds. In the bonds of glucose are the energy that we can change, that our cells can change from that energy to the energy, enough energy to attach a phosphate to ADP to make it ATP. And that's when we break that, our cells can use that energy for whatever they need. Okay. Why do we need oxygen? It's the final ion acceptor in the electron transport chain. You, by the way, probably need to know this. That is something that you need to know from the past. I've had students that do not seem to be able to remember it. Glucose is for that has the energy in the bonds. Oxygen is because it's the final ion acceptor in the electron transport chain that allows us to get those 34 ATP instead of just 4 out of the 38. You also ought to probably know this formula. C6H12O6 plus O2, oxygen. In the end result, we go through the whole process, we get carbon dioxide, we get water, and we get ATP. So it's basically glucose, oxygen, put it through the process of glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, those 3 steps. You get carbon dioxide, you get water, and you get ATP, 38 ATP. Okay, so that answers the question now. It's not just because you'll die. Hopefully now you understand exactly what glucose and oxygen do for you. Again, I know I'm repeating it, and you're like, just shut up, Williamson. I get it. But no, glucose gives us the energy in the bonds to break that, and we can use that energy after eventually to produce energy to attach a phosphate to ADP to make it ATP. Why oxygen? It's the final ion acceptor in the electron transport chain. Without oxygen, we don't get 38 ATP, we only get 4. And that's not sustainable. Hopefully, you took good notes. If you have any questions, please ask them in the end questions or in class. Review them. If anything doesn't make sense, please let me know. I want you to understand this. It's not the details, it's the overall concept. Hopefully you understand that. If you have any questions, let me know. Good luck.